Hello, everybody, and welcome to this lunch hour brought to you by UK and a Changing Europe. I'm Jill Rutter. I'm a Senior Research Fellow at UK and a Changing Europe, and I'm just back from the SNP conference in Aberdeen, where we hosted a very successful fringe meeting. The SNP conference is, of course, still going on there, but today we're going to discuss Scotland's future as well. To do that, I'm joined by a terrific panel. In no particular order, I have Dr. Nicola McEwen from the University of Glasgow, Dr. Coree Brown-Swan from the University of Stirling, though Coree's done a sort of recent tour, as far as I can see, of UK universities, Professor John Curtice from the University of Strathclyde, and last but by no means least, I can now call him Professor Ciaran Martin, but now a professor in practice at Blavatnik School of Government at the University of Oxford. But crucially, Ciaran was Constitution Director in the UK Cabinet Office when the Edinburgh Agreement was reached, which you will remember led to the 2014 independence referendum. So we're going to spend the next hour looking at Scotland's future in light both of the Rutherglen by-election 10 days ago or so and the more recent SNP conference taking place in the shadow of that by-election. And I see some of you already on the case in a very effective way. Do send in all your questions on Slido and I'll try to weave them in to the discussion. I see some that I was going to ask anyway already popping in. So let me start. Nicola, what exactly did the SNP agree at their conference on Sunday in their compromise proposal on the next general election and what it might or might not mean for independence?
Yeah, so it's a little bit confusing in terms of the wording, and I think that reflects the sort of negotiations that tried to get a unity position that united the different strands. But as far as I can see, in a sense, I suppose what they agreed was that independence would be at the forefront of their campaign. They agreed that they would consider a majority of MPs from the SNP as being a mandate to negotiate, but negotiate what? And I think it's essentially still to negotiate the power to decide on Scotland's future. So there's a lot of continuity here in terms of the desirability of a referendum as part of the strategy. But essentially, I think what this motion was about was agreeing a position that the party could live with, that could enable them to park the issues of process in order to move on more to the issues of substance about what independence would mean, and to start trying to build support so that there is a consistent majority in favour of independence, which there is not at the moment.
And does that differ from the position that Nicola Sturgeon had articulated as First Minister?
Yes, I think it does. So Nicola Sturgeon had latterly hinted at using the UK general election as almost a sort of de facto referendum on independence in the absence of the Scottish Parliament having the power to legislate for an independence referendum of its own. And that was very controversial. That was very unsettling within the party. So I think it is a departure from that. That was obviously born of frustration of not being able to be in control of the process issues. But I think there was some disquiet within the party about that, and they have, I think, moved on a bit with this motion.
Okay, so that position now depends on the SNP winning a majority of a slightly reduced number of seats, I think, in Scotland in the upcoming general election. John, we build this event as taking place in the wake of the Rutherglen by-election. I don't know whether you think that gives us a good indication, but where do we think the SNP might realistically be looking to in terms of numbers of seats in Westminster after the next general election?
Well, you're right. The number of parliamentary seats in Scotland will be reduced from 59 to 57 as a part of the boundary review, but it's not going to make a radical difference. So if we take the average of the opinion polls that have been conducted since the beginning of September, there are about a half a dozen of them. On average, the SNP are at 36%. That's 9 points down on what they secured in the December 2019 UK election, while the Labour Party are running at 32%, which is up 13. The Conservatives are back down to about 17%. That's 8 points down on 2019, and the Liberal Democrats are running at around 7. That's also down a bit on 2019. So the first thing to bear in mind, despite the fairly dramatic headlines, not least of the Rutherglen by-election result, which I'll come back to, most polls still have the SNP ahead, though only marginally. And as a result, if that polling were correct, then the SNP would still be favourites to have the most, to win a majority of the seats in Scotland, although the Labour Party would probably pick up around 20 or so seats, and that potentially has implications for the outcome of the UK election overall, because the more seats the Labour Party can pick up in Scotland, the less the lead over the Conservatives they need in order to get an overall majority. And at the moment, Labour face a pretty adverse electoral geography on that count. Now, that swing that from the SNP to Labour Party that is registered by the opinion polls is currently running at 11%. In contrast, the swing in Rutherglen was 20%. So you can quite reasonably ask, well, which of those do we believe? Well, the first thing I think one has to bear in mind is that by-elections not uncommonly exaggerate the swings against a government when a government is in a degree of measure of electoral trouble. We saw this in the Selby by-election in Yorkshire not so long ago, and we'll get more evidence on this in the Tamworth and Mid-Bedfordshire by-elections on Thursday. If the Rutherglen by-election were a true reflection of where Scotland is as a whole is at, then you'd be talking about the Labour Party being back to around the 40 seats that they got back in 2010 before the disaster of the 2015 election. And yes, the SNP would no longer have a majority. So the SNP are certainly down. But one thing to bear, well, there are two things I think then that has to be borne in mind. And which one of them at least I think is often forgotten. The first is that the rise of the Labour Party in Scotland predates the decline of the SNP. The Labour Party was already running at 30% in Scotland by the end of last calendar year, and essentially the Labour Party in Scotland profited from exactly the same reasons as the Labour Party in England. That is, one, Boris Johnson and Partygate, and two, Liz Truss and her fiscal event. And Labour's progress during the course of this year has been rather more minimal. The second thing to say, that what has certainly happened this year is that a substantial gap has opened up between the level of support for independence and level of support for the SNP. One of the intriguing things that we'd reached to in Scotland by the 2021 Scottish Parliament election was that politics in Scotland were beginning to like the politics of Northern Ireland. That is, that basically the constitutional question was dominating to more or less the exclusion of everything else, and pretty much everybody who was in favour of independence were voting for the SNP, and pretty much nobody everybody who was opposed to independence, they were not voting for the SNP. Now a gap has opened up because actually support for independence, you quite rightly pointed out, it's still a little less than half. It's actually running on average at 49% at the moment, and that's pretty much where it's been for most of the time for the last 4 years. But it's 49% for independence, whereas support for the SNP is down at 36%. And certainly one of the challenges facing the party, apart from indeed wanting to get support for independence above the 50% mark, is to try to close that gap and try to persuade some of the people who at the moment say they would still vote yes, but are now minded to vote for the Labour Party to return into the Nationalist fold.
So, John, do you think this sort of mandate take from Hamza Yousaf, the sort of compromise that emerged at the SNP conference, does that galvanise people into the SNP camp who might otherwise be wavering and thinking they're Labour? I went to a really interesting presentation by the Scottish Election Study yesterday, which said that the big priority for most SNP voters was to get the Conservatives out. And I just wondered how that might play out when we actually get to putting that X in the on the ballot paper next year.
Yeah, I'm aware of that research, and opinion for the Tony Blair Institute have also come with something similar. Well, I mean, the short answer to Jill is that the challenge to the SNP is to persuade yes voters that there isn't any choice. Because the truth is, we know that the SNP would not be willing to sustain a minority Conservative administration. And to that extent, at least, it doesn't matter whether voters in Scotland vote for the SNP or vote for Labour, so far as the fate of a Conservative administration is concerned. Now, of course, the Labour Party are trying to argue the opposite. They're trying to say you need to vote for us in order to ensure that we can throw the Conservatives out. But actually, now, of course, the difficulty the SNP faces, they have to persuade people that they are indeed as violently opposed to the Conservatives and Labour Party, while at the same time not wanting to suggest that they necessarily welcome the prospect of a Labour government. And I suppose, in part, therefore, the challenge to the SNP is whether or not they're going to be willing to dabble in the potentially infested waters of a hung parliament, because at the end of the day, the scenario that is most likely to produce a independence referendum sooner rather than later is a hung parliament in which the SNP does at some point have leverage, which you can then try to exercise against the minority Labour government. But that will only happen if the SNP can retain their support in Scotland, and indeed in so doing, perhaps reduce the chances of the Labour Party getting an overall majority. But of course, getting those kinds of arguments across is potentially quite difficult. But certainly the SNP, in a sense, have to challenge the Labour argument that the only way to kick the Conservatives out is to vote for the Labour Party in Scotland.
So, Ciaran, just coming onto this, if the SNP did get, let's say, 30 plus seats, gets over that 29 barrier, and came and said, we've got a majority of seats, the people of Scotland knew what they were voting for, we told them in advance, it's whatever, now give us a referendum or some other way of giving democratic effect, I think was the words to this decision. How would a UK government react to that?
Whoever it is will say immediately no, and will be now in an unassailable legal position. And in my view, others may disagree, will suffer absolutely no political detriment from so doing. And I think it's what happened. I think personally, and again, the more expert fellow panelists may disagree, but I think in the grand scheme of history, in terms of the constitutional future of Scotland, the 2024 general election will likely prove largely inconsequential. It's what happens in the full parliament or two parliaments after it that will be really important. Okay,
that's really interesting. So we have a scenario potentially with an SNP that may or may not have its mandate. It'd be very interesting if it didn't reach that threshold as well. I want to come on to actually what do things look like then? If we assume that there is a sort of Labour government after an election, come on to what might happen if there were a Conservative government after an election. Yeah, Coree, how would we see them handling Scotland? If there's a majority Labour government and still an SNP government in Holyrood, at least for a couple of years, because Holyrood elections, I think, aren't until 2026, what differences might we see in the way they handle them? Do they have any signs of an offer to Scotland that might come through?
I think the campaign at this point has been focused on the potential of a Labour government getting out the Tories, and that's what they're saying on the doorsteps. That's what they've been saying in conference speeches, etc. However, what happens once they've done that, or if they do that? I think the increased success of the Labour Party might lead to increased scrutiny. We see Swan and Starmer very much in lockstep, presenting very much a united front, but there are significant policy differences between Scottish Labour and UK Labour, and these are likely to emerge once you see a fully fleshed manifesto and in the early years of a Labour government. we see that decoupling that John mentioned of support for independence, which poses that opportunity for Labour to say, hey, you're asking for us to deal with things beyond the Constitution. People are suffering due to cost of living, due to energy prices. And I think they can present a credible case for that. But that constitutional issue remains important for people. I think, and we can think of a Labour government whenever the next UK general election takes place as facing very difficult decisions. And will that government, which has promised some sort of constitutional reform, have the actual capacity to deliver that? Will it have the capacity to pay attention to Scotland and what Scotland's policy priorities are? Maybe that doesn't matter in the grand scheme of UK politics, but it probably matters in Scotland. And then we can look ahead to the 2026 Holyrood election. Labour will again make political capital out of the potential of Labour-led governments in Edinburgh, Cardiff, and in London. But this election will fall at kind of near the midpoint of a UK government, which might complicate the case made by Scottish Labour, which will have to defend decisions which might be quite unpopular taken at the centre. So I think there's both opportunities for Labour. They seem to be on the up. They seem increasingly confident of their ability to make that case, but there's some real challenges that lie ahead.
So Nicola, one of the things that quite interesting there is the sort of notion of Starmer Labour and Sarwar Labour as being quite different. How do we think we'd see if there were, you know, more than one Scottish Labour MP for the first time in a while in Parliament? Do we think they would? How do we think those Labour MPs might operate? We already saw, I think, some differences in some of the positions that Keir Mather took to the ones that Keir Mather or Michael Shanks, who won Rutherglen, took in that election to the ones that Keir Starmer's been taking nationally. Do we think Scottish Labour would act as a sort of separate bloc in Westminster?
It might depend on how many they are and how unified they acted. Traditionally, Scottish Labour MPs in Westminster have not acted in that way. They've not particularly assumed a territorial dimension, but then Scottish politics is rather different than it was the last time Scottish Labour had a big block of MPs down there. I think if they do well in Scotland in the next general election, they will probably feel vindicated in not really talking about the Constitution at all, and not really thinking about the powers and the settlement, which may or may not be a missed opportunity. It was interesting, actually, the motion that we were talking about earlier that was passed at the SNP conference talked not just about independence, but more powers. So it'll be interesting to see how much they move on to that agenda in terms of reforming the devolution settlement. A lot may depend on how UK Labour and a UK Labour government responds to Wales, where there is a Labour government that they are responding to as well. And we would expect later on this year, when the Constitutional Commission presents, that it has already been very critical of devolution as it stands, and the union as it stands, and whether there is pressure from within the Labour family there to do something more in the constitutional space. But I agree with Coree that I'm not convinced that there will be much appetite to do that, either from UK Labour or Scottish Labour, and they may feel comfortable in that space if the SNP support declines, but I would be mindful of the continued levels of support for independence, because that in itself is a signal that a rather large number of people in Scotland are not content with the way the union is currently configured.
We've got a question here. I'm going to come to Ciaran on managing intergovernmental relations with a sort of Labour majority or maybe a Labour minority. But John, question about where, what's accounting for this difference, and where have the sort of pro-independence, but I'm not voting SNP, where have those voters gone to now in terms of party preference? Do we know?
Okay. There is certainly an interesting debate going on as to why the gap has emerged. If you talk to people who are close to the SNP, they want to blame Margaret Ferrier in particular for the difficulties in Rutherglen. and they will want to point the finger at the police investigation to the SNP's finances. In other words, it wasn't us. Meanwhile, those closest to Labour Party are keen to argue that it is now the prospect of a majority Labour government that is tempting Labour voters, tempting voters in Labour's direction. The problem with relying on these two arguments as the principal explanation for the SNP's difficulty is that it doesn't fit the timeline. So as I already pointed out, the prospect of a majority Labour government emerged in October of last year, but the SNP's support for the SNP was still running at 43% before Nicola Sturgeon resigned, i.e. barely down at all. Equally, if you look at the timeline of what happened in the wake of the police investigation, actually support for the SNP did not go down at all in the wake of the first arrest and subsequent release, that is, of course, of Peter Murrell, the former chief executive, although it did then get depressed a little bit further in the wake of the subsequent arrest and then release of Nicola Sturgeon. The principal period during which support for the SNP fell is between the announcement by Nicola Sturgeon that she was going to resign in the middle of February of this year and the announcement that Humza Yousaf was the new leader at the back end of March. Well, what happened during that period? Well, one, it was a pretty fractious leadership contest. Divisions that had already been partly fueled by the internal argument about the gender recognition bill, but which then exposed wider disagreements within the SNP, which are still continuing. And one of the things that's very clear from the polling is that people are now much more likely to think of the SNP as being divided than was the case a year ago. The second thing, of course, is the SNP have a new leader. And the brutal truth is that Humza Yousaf is nothing like as popular as his predecessor. And frankly, that includes within the SNP. What the most remarkable thing about the outcome of the SNP leadership contest was that despite having the vast majority of the public declarations by elected SNP parliamentarians in Edinburgh and in London, many of whom, of course, pretty much were very heavily critical of Kate Forbes' rather socially conservative views on certain matters. Despite that, he only won by 52% to 48%. So that left him in a relatively weak position. And I think that the problem the party now also faces is that they've had two extremely charismatic leaders, both of them very effective at raising their party support. We know what happened when the last time they didn't have a charismatic leader, i.e. John Sweeney. In many ways, a very competent and highly effective politician, but no great campaigner, and the SNP struggled. So I would suggest that actually we should be looking much more at the state of the SNP itself as being where the problem arises, and that effectively a body of people, including some of those who would still vote yes, have lost confidence in the SNP as a political organisation. And where have they gone? Well, they've gone disproportionately to the Labour Party. I mean, the Labour Party's now got the support of about 20% of those who voted yes in 2014, although the truth is the opinion polls don't really give us the data we really want, which is the breakdown by people's current support. I think probably in terms of current support, the Labour Party's probably got about 1 in 6 current yes supporters. And we have to remember the Labour Party is still primarily dependent on unionist voters. Indeed, one of the other things that's happened in the last 12 months is the Labour Party is now the most popular party amongst unionist voters. It has displaced the Conservative Party so far as that position is concerned.
Okay, right. So that's really interesting. Ciaran, if we had a Labour government, let's say for now, a majority Labour government, how do you think it would change the handling of intergovernmental relations compared to the way in which the Conservative government has handled it? Would we see much difference, and would we see any significant offer on powers? Do you think there are areas that they should be putting on the table potentially for a sort of Devo more offer? And where do those Brown reforms that big Brown commission do they just get quietly buried, or do they make a comeback?
I think it's very hard to tell. on the one hand, you have this much heralded report, trumpeted at the time. Of course, you had leaks around it being a little delayed and being hastily rewritten and so forth. You have leaks over the weekend about the scaling back, to put it mildly, of the plan to reform the Lords. I mean, it's traditional for Labour governments to roll back on Lords reform when in office rather than before getting to office, but they seem to have sort of even preempted it this time. So it's very difficult. I think that, you know, I think there is now divergence between the two main UK-wide unionist parties, the Labour and the Conservatives, at Westminster level about how they approach devolution. You know, Cameron, I mean, Labour had that rather extraordinary period in the early years of devolution where, you know, Scotland and Wales, the sort of the architecture of devolution was set up as if Labour was going to be in power in all three jurisdictions indefinitely. The Conservatives, of course, were the ones to test having no representation in the devolved governments, but actually continued, if you like, initially with a very respectful, in effect, you know, if you look at that leak from the or that publication from the COVID inquiry about Boris Johnson saying, we're not going to pretend this is a mini EU. I mean, the early days of David Cameron sort of did feel a little bit like that, if I'm honest. And I think that, you know, I think there are basically three ways in which Westminster can manage the territorial union. There's the muscular way, favoured by a growing number of Conservatives, where you assert the British state, you go for that Boris Johnson, this is a unitary state, this is not a mini EU. These are essentially powerful local councils in Cardiff, Edinburgh, and Belfast, another story. You have the sort of multinational, the Mark Drakeford vision, which is a little bit reflected in the Brown report, although the Drakeford version is much, much stronger and much more quasi-federal. And then you've got the muddling through. Now, I think in government, you'll invariably muddle through, but which way do you lean? And I think a Conservative government will lean muscular and a Labour government will lean multinational. But then it comes back to Coree's point about energy, bandwidths, pressures. What does Scottish Labour want? What do they think? And I suspect, if I had to bet on it, but I don't know, I'm not even sure they get around to a cosmetic offering for a couple of reasons. One is bandwidth. The other is there's not a great deal that's easy to devolve further. I mean, Nicola will know a lot more about this than I will, but, you know, it's a lot of effort to think about further areas, a lot of controversy, a lot of Scottish Labour won't like it. It's also a question, ultimately, about how much all of this matters in terms of intergovernmental relations. And I think some of it does matter. I think the tone you set, whether you're in, you know, I think that thing from Boris Johnson in the COVID inquiry will probably cut through more than the niceties of cooperation on cross-border health issues, to be honest, in terms of perceptions, national identity and so forth. The fact that you've got such an abrasive statement, and it's not the first from a senior Conservative on devolution. But there's another thing which I think we haven't really discussed, because I don't see the constitutional question in Scotland being brought to a head anytime soon, which is essentially the success of the next Labour government, or the next government. Let's say it is a Labour government, it seems more likely than not. You know, by 2030, will the argument that, look, we came here, we had an SNP obsessed with the constitution, we came here to deal with bread and butter issues, we came here to focus on the priorities that matter, and so forth. How will that sound in 2030, given that they've got a hell of a job ahead of them? And how will that affect the opinion and national identity and feelings of Scots in not very long? That will be a bit more interesting, frankly, and I think more decisive than how the technocracy of intergovernmental relations work.
That's really interesting. Nicola, what do you think about that? Do you think that actually trying a Labour government and it perhaps failing, got some questions about the power of Labour's retail offer in Scotland, whether that's sort of going to move many voters in Scotland, because quite a lot of their promises are ones that they can only really deliver for England, given devolution. But do you think that you know, maybe the fate of the union depends on whether the Labour government looks successful? Maybe it's only a one-term Labour government if it's not got a very big majority and swings back.
Yeah, I do think that in a way. I think the narrative is important as well. So if an incoming Labour government has a focus on its missions, and its missions are largely concentrated within England, then that tends to feed the narrative that it is perhaps a government that is more centred on on development within England with knock-on effects for the devolved territories. I don't think that's what a Labour government wants to do. And I actually do think the intergovernmental aspect is important. I've long thought that it's a kind of site where territorial politics is played out in the day-to-day, in the relationships between the governments. I would expect, like Ciaran, that a Labour government would lean more towards a less competitive approach to devolution. I'm less convinced that that means they would roll back on some of the tools that the Conservatives have, the Conservative government has given itself around, for example, the United Kingdom Internal Market Act, or spending powers, the powers to spend in areas of devolved territories. I'm not really hearing any appetite from the Labour Party that they would revisit that. And, you know, this sounds quite technical, but it's hugely controversial from a devolution perspective. And so that's where there's maybe a narrative of a multinational UK can take you so far, but it has to be translated into relationships and the patterns of power between the constituent territories.
That's really interesting. Coree, do you have any sort of views on actually, you know, what will really matter to people in Scotland to sort of judge the sustainability, if you like, of what might happen after 2024?
Sure. I mean, I think voters in Scotland are concerned about the same things that voters throughout the UK are concerned about in terms of cost and their livelihoods. But it's so much of the debate in Scotland is kind of translated or viewed through the prism of these constitutional politics. So I think it's a challenge to move away from that. And think about how you can make that retail offering. And I wonder, just to pick up on Nicola's point about the retail offer in Scotland and the kind of English focus on the missions, is that a result perhaps of the fact that the UK Labour Party hasn't had kind of Scottish voices at the centre of the party, making the case for what's different in Scotland, what might appeal to a Scottish voter. So perhaps with a higher number of Scottish MPs coming from the Labour Party, those voices will once again re-emerge. But I was struck as well by the tone of the Labour conference. It was a very English-centred conversation. I think the challenge for Labour moving forward is to speak to those English voters who we know are a bit different than Scottish voters, or have different concerns, particularly when you look at how people prioritise the issue of small boats and immigration, and speak to Scottish voters at the same time. So there needs to be kind of a comprehensive narrative there, but I think that's quite a difficult one to deliver.
And John, how do you think that, you know, if there was a change in Westminster, how does that set up the Holyrood elections 2 years later? Does that give an impetus and momentum, or is, you know, Labour in Scotland, if it is a Labour government in the UK, does that sort of basically mean they have to suffer the midterm blues against a government that isn't theirs? You know, how does it weigh again? How do voters weigh, you know, N years of SNP government in Scotland as the record they're judging versus a Westminster government in Holyrood elections?
Well, I mean, the broad answer to that question, Jill, is it will depend on who manages to win the blame game. I mean, the first thing, obviously, to say is, you know, as the Institute for Fiscal Studies have underlined only this morning, the backdrop with which a incoming government of, whether it's Conservative or Labour, will be faced after the next election is not exactly an inviting one. You know, we are essentially, as a country, in a position where we've maxed out our credit card. The public services aren't working, but we already have record levels of taxation, and it's how a government gets out of that bind that will be crucial. But given particularly, I mean, it's the Labour Party, you know, is now implicitly recognising in what it's saying and what it is and isn't promising. There's going to be very little room for increasing public expenditure, because the Conservative administration has already scheduled quite a lot of cuts. And that, of course, potentially has implications for the Scottish budget. But the Scottish budget itself is under very severe pressure, partly for the same reasons as in England, i.e. the increasing age of Scotland's population and the state of the health service and the aging of the health. But also, of course, because of the decision that, and this is the one bit of divergence that's happened in the wake of Smith that is discussed little, but in budgetary terms is very important. And that is the expansion, the creation of a somewhat separate social security system in Scotland, which of course is not funded through Barnett consequentials. So the question therefore will be that, it's probably going to be true that between now and 2026, the Scottish government will indeed struggle within the limitations of the tax powers it's got, the limitations of what it gets from London in the way of consequentials, and the difficulties of public services. But who do voters blame? Do they blame London or do they blame Edinburgh? Now, I mean, the history of these tends to be that when things go badly, people in Scotland are more inclined to blame London than they are Edinburgh. But that is a constant battle which will be fought out during the course of the next couple of years.
Okay, that sounds all very edifying and something to pencil in to look forward to in terms of uplifting election campaign to come. Got quite a lot of questions coming in about impacts on the SNP, if what would happen if there's a request, they get the mandate and then request turned down? Does that give a sort of further boost to independence? And another question, if it looks as though the independence question isn't getting anywhere, maybe they fail to get that mandate, takes it slightly off the table, does the SNP end up splitting? I think, John, you were pointing to differences, we've got differences of approach between different people, and we saw that quite big ideological divide emerging between Humza Yousaf and Kate Martin. Nicola, what do you think the future holds for the SNP?
Who knows? I mean, I don't think it's on the verge of splitting. If that was going to happen, then Alapa would have rather more members than it has. So you're absolutely right that the leadership contest was bruising and exposed some internal differences on ideology, but actually I think the most bruising aspect of that was the questions over the competence of the leader and now First Minister, and that's been perhaps one of the most difficult things that he's had to wrestle with as First Minister in the post, that perception that was nurtured even from within his own party. I suppose we're never far away from an election in Scotland. So no sooner will the UK Westminster election be decided that we will be looking ahead to the Holyrood elections. If the SNP were to secure the majority, I suppose again it would depend on what difference was the winning margin, but I suppose it is also important to remember that in Scotland, as in Wales, and obviously it's this case in Northern Ireland, even though it's a UK general election and ultimately it's about who governs the UK, there are parallel elections going on within the smaller nations, and these are really important to determining what happens in the future of the Union. If the SNP declines a lot and comes second to Labour in that parallel election, then I do think it harms the constitution, or it parks the constitutional debate for a while. And I suppose the SNP would then hope that if it is a Labour government, then it disappoints. If it is a Conservative government, then it continues to make it look like Westminster is not the future for Scotland, and they will try to turn that around in time for the next Holyrood election. If they do secure what they see as a mandate and the UK government says no, which I agree with Ciaran, I think they would say no, whoever leads that government, then the SNP will try to use that to mobilise support around independence and increase support for independence ahead of the Holyrood election. There was a bit in the motion that was passed yesterday that they would reconsider if in that event using the Holyrood election to try to secure a mandate. It was a little bit ambiguous as to what that meant, if that was a sort of Catalan style, let's go all out to have a pro-independence list vote potentially. But all of that, I think, would have to be revisited after the UK election.
So, Coree, I've got a question here. This is a bit of an unfair question on you, which is, why is no one mentioning Brexit? Should we be mentioning Brexit in this conversation? Does the EU sort of do it? I'm going to come to, we've got lots of people saying yes. So, Coree, John, and Nicola, should we be talking about Brexit? Is that still having a massive effect here? And does the prospect of Scotland rejoining the EU ultimately have a big appeal? And would it make a difference, I think, if we had better relations with the EU along the lines that Keir Starmer has said he would like a relationship reset? Coree, do you want to kick off with that? If not, others want to jump in. So
sure. So I think, Brexit obviously was kind of that pivotal point, reigniting the independence debate, but also making independence much more complicated to pursue and to deliver outside the umbrella of the European Union. I don't think we talk about the public discourse focuses on that attribution of blaming Brexit for what's going on in various situations, but we don't really talk about Brexit to the same degree anymore. I think where we see its effect is those kind of tense intergovernmental negotiations over policy areas and kind of the UK Internal Market Act, etc. So you see kind of Brexit, kind of the ramifications of Brexit, but we're not really seeing a larger discussion about kind of Brexit in general. It's not something that you kind of see in political discourse in the same way as you did in recent years. But I think a closer relationship, if Labour pursues a closer relationship with the EU, that would be viewed positively in Scotland, which was much more Remainy than other parts of the UK.
John, should we be talking about Brexit?
Well, I mean, Coree is right that from the perspective of the SNP, we should be talking about Brexit more than we should, though I think one has to say the SNP are very happy to talk about Brexit. It's the Labour Party that doesn't want to talk about Brexit, so it's a somewhat asymmetric discourse. If I were to be asked what I thought was the fundamental failure of Nicola Sturgeon in the last 12 months or so of her position as First Minister, it was to fail to get the post-Brexit independent debate to take off. The truth is that Brexit has fundamentally changed the intellectual question that Scotland faces in terms of its constitutional future. And it has also, I mean, the fact that we've got 49% support in Scotland rather than 45% is basically to do with Brexit. And Brexit's also changed the character of support for independence. There was, if you go back to the 2014 referendum, although we spent hours arguing about whether an independent Scotland could or could not be a continuing member of the European Union, there was no relationship between people's attitudes towards the EU and whether they voted yes or no. Now, in fact, I just checked this morning, amongst those people who voted to remain inside the EU, which of course is now getting to rather ancient history, you're looking at about 55% support yes. Amongst those who voted to leave, which of course is a minority in Scotland, you're looking at support at about 30%, and those gaps would be wider if you had data on current preference. So these two issues are now intertwined. But what Sturgeon wasn't able to do, I mean, the pandemic created a big pause because, of course, we had Brexit, we had the hard TCA, but then we were still in the middle of the pandemic, so it didn't take off. The Scottish government has started producing various papers about its vision on independence, but its particular misfortune, which was what was arguably the crucial paper that might have got the debate started, which was on the economics of post-Brexit independence, it came out on the same day as Jeremy Hunt flew the white flag over Kwasi Kwarteng's tax cuts, roughly this time last year. So it never got any purchase. But the truth is, I think the SNP have now implicitly recognised this. They do actually, above all, need to get a debate about independence started, and they need to get a debate started on the question not of whether or not simply Scotland should be inside or outside the United Kingdom, but rather which do you prefer? Scotland inside the UK but outside the European Union, or Scotland inside the European Union but outside the UK? And all sorts of trade-offs come with that choice that we were not debating back in 2014, and we've not really had a discourse about as yet. So, I mean, the SNP have been talking at their conference about getting a campaign started, getting the levels of support for independence above 50%. At the end of the day, that is the first thing that above all they have to do. And in so doing, they need to actually be able to get that debate started, to get the numbers up, because at the moment, one of the reasons why the unions can just say no is because they can presume that probably just a majority of people are in favour of the union. But the risk they are taking is that if the SNP and the wider Yes movement ever succeed in getting the debate started, and that's a big if, and as a result they push the numbers up, then at some point unions are going to have to decide how long they're going to vacate the field. Or will they and then actually find that they do need to get involved in the debate, even if there isn't a prospect of a referendum, because otherwise there is a risk that support for the union is eroded. So Brexit is fundamental to where we are at, but whether or not the SNP can actually get the debate going is, I think, a major question. In a sense, is a more important question, and always has been a more important question than the arguments about process that Nicola Sturgeon started in her speech back in June of last year.
Nicola, do you agree with that?
Yeah, June of last year, that's right, yeah.
Nicola, do you agree with John there?
Yeah, I do agree with that. I mean, I think Brexit's absolutely critical. It's a little bit like, if we think back to the long Home Rule movement that led to the Scottish Parliament, if you ask anyone to pick a moment, they would probably talk about the poll tax or successive election defeats or whatever. But there are key things that you can point to in the journey that led to the Scottish Parliament that live on as legacy issues in a sense. Brexit, I think, is one of those, partly because it changed the UK's status in the world and in relation to its neighbours, partly because it has affected the UK's economic outlook, but crucially because it was a massive decision on the UK's future that was taken without the consent of Scotland as expressed in the referendum. And I think all of that matters. That said, Brexit also complicated independence because it gave rise to the issue of, and particularly the former Brexit that we had in the TCA, and it gave rise to the issue of a hard border between Scotland and the rest of the UK, which is extremely difficult to sell in any independence campaign. Now, the irony is, if Keir Starmer is to become the next Prime Minister and is to reset that relationship in some form, big question marks over whether or not he can do that. But if he was to secure, for example, a veterinary agreement that reduced the need for checks on the border, then some of the border issues around independence diminish significantly. On the other hand, if he raises expectations and is not able to deliver, then that is problematic too for the Union, because then where does that leave Scotland and its relationship with the European Union if it remains part of the United Kingdom? So difficult to see which direction things go in, but I think Brexit still matters and will matter for some time to come.
So Ciaran, if independence doesn't go off the table, hovers, near to 50%, not, maybe goes up slightly, maybe dips down a bit, but, we've got questions here about, if government, the unionist parties continue to say, you don't get a choice, we're not going to give you a referendum. Is that sort of sustainable and healthy in the longer term? Tim Loynig, who used to be an advisor in government's just written on his Substack a proposition that there should be a sort of right to a secession referendum every 20 years, but the sort of nationalist parties could postpone it and have it 10 years later if they sort of looked at the numbers and thought, well, we're not going to win now. but as a way of saying you do get a choice, you just don't get it, just don't have to campaign for it all the time and it dominate issues maybe in the way that it's dominated in Scotland since the constitutional question really came to the fore. And does the UK government need to be a bit more imaginative about its offer to sustain the union? I think you've written quite a lot about this.
For the small number of people who pay attention to such matters, as you've alluded to, Jill, people would know that I think one of the oddities of the British Constitution is that, unlike, say, Spain, we tolerate lawful secessionist movements and recognise their aspirations as legitimate, but don't provide a mechanism outside of a very vague mechanism in Northern Ireland. We don't provide a guaranteed mechanism for those objectives to be achieved. But that's where we are. There's no enthusiasm in the Conservative Party or the Labour Party for such a mechanism. So I think we'll find one. I don't think we'll find one. So I think, but I do think there are really powerful dynamics going on. And at a time when we're all talking about the long term and we're very short termist in this country, I do think a lot of the discussion, not this one, but a lot of the discussion around Scotland's future really is quite short termist. I mean, the Rutherglen by-election will not, in the grand scheme of things, decide whether or not the union survives. And a lot of the discussion has been around, I think a constitutional referendum on independence is off the table. It's overwhelmingly likely it's off the table for the next Westminster Parliament. Now, that's a long time in politics. It's an eternity in politics, but it's a very short period in history. And, I think we're missing two fundamental things that have just happened. John alluded to them. The first is that the Conservatives, whether you like it or not, the Conservatives have already defeated the SNP's demands for a referendum in the post-Brexit period in the most favourable circumstances imaginable. The Brexit vote, Boris Johnson, Partygate, etc., but they have defeated those demands. I think it is now beyond doubt that that period is over. However, they've not slain independence, which, as John has laid out, is now polling 4 percentage points higher than it was at the time of the referendum. But why is that? Well, so why are we in this slight position where the issue hasn't gone away? But it's partly the intensity of that 49%, in my view. John will know more, but the intensity of the feeling that they want this sorted out is not that strong. It's partly the profound weakness of the primary political vehicle, the SNP, and I think that's not in dispute. And there's a greater strength of resolve at Westminster to just face this down. You don't have to yield to my demands for a mechanism because most people don't really care. And I just think strategically then, there are a number of other things happening. If you were a sort of strategist for something that doesn't exist called Scottish nationalism, it's a collection of people and institutions trying to achieve an outcome. But if you're trying to find a way, my sort of slight quirky suggestion is find a way to lose power in Holyrood in 2026. Yeah. Because, there'll be so many, in the long run, there are so many things, you'll have, what will the attractiveness of the UK look like in the 2030s in terms of things that were cornerstones of the 2014 referendum, the state pension, things like that, the state of public services. Will there have been a Labour government that hasn't changed the constitution and hasn't, improved conditions? Will there be quite a strongly anti-devolution Conservative government? What will the demographics have done after a period of time? And it will then, of course, be a generation since 2014. And so, if you were to John's previous point, you'd almost want to sort of say, go away and think about the answers to Nicola's Brexit questions. How are you going to sort of convince people? Because I do think that there isn't going to be a mechanism. I don't think Westminster's looking for a mechanism, but there's something subtle that's happened in the last few years, which is that in a very sort of British way that's consistent with constitutional history, almost inadvertently, people have started, like Alistair Jack said several times, well, if it was consistent, around 60% and it was 25 years since 2014, that would be the conditions that nobody could object to. Well, in 2034, you could well have those conditions, and that's not a very long time away. So I do think, both sides will want to be thinking long term about this in a way that, the ups and downs of individual parties and the 2024 election probably won't matter that much in the grand scheme of things. But the current period is over. The post-Brexit, I actually sort of say, why aren't we talking about Brexit? Because I think in terms of the decisive impact on Scotland's constitutional future, my own view is that the union has survived the 2016 trauma for now.
So I was at a conference in Northern Ireland last year where they were talking about 24 years since it's a Good Friday Agreement, and all the panels going on, well, it's been a really long time. And the person from Sinn Féin said, it's been no time at all, really, because Sinn Féin, ultimate people who take a very, very, very long view of the time it takes to get the change you want. I'm just intrigued from our panelists who are in Scotland about whether they think there is an offer that a Labour, a Conservative, whatever constellation of government we might have post-election could make to actually make the union a more attractive proposition. We've had muscular unionism from Boris Johnson. We've had, putting Union Jacks on funding and things like that to make it clear that the money is coming from the UK taxpayer. Not sure. Is there a sort of, any way of changing the dynamic in the other direction? Ciaran's given us his things can only get grim enough vision for mid-2030s, give the SNP some hope. Is there anything that might sort of start to change minds in the other direction? Or we have to live with the fact that 49% of people in Scotland basically would rather out of the current arrangements? John.
Well, I'll jump in quickly. I think one always finds it rather remarkable that a Brexit-inclined government thinks that funding a few projects and putting up a sign saying funded by whoever is a way of cementing the popularity of that institution. I can well remember once being on holiday on a remote island on Orkney, and there was a barley field funded by the European Union. I mean, much good all of that ever did the European Union. So point one. Point two is, and that's one reason to believe why the debate isn't going to go away. One is that the long-term consequence of the 2014 referendum was a long-term increase in the level of support for independence. Before that referendum, it was very definitely a minority view in Scotland. And of course, as Ciaran's already referred to, the demographics are disadvantageous to the union because there's now a stronger relationship between age and attitudes towards the constitutional question than existed in 2014. But what can the union do? Well, to be honest, probably the answer to Scotland is the same as the answer to the United Kingdom as a whole. And it comes back to that problem I referred to earlier. If the United Kingdom can get itself out of the economic and fiscal hole that it is currently in, and probably along the way also at least softens its relationship with the European Union, then maybe you can begin to turn things around. But although one could ask some very, very tough questions about whether or not independence would or would not be economically advantageous to Scotland in current circumstances, the truth is that because the way in which the UK's recent economic experience is as bad as it is, it's always therefore possible for people to point to the status quo as being unsatisfactory, and therefore something that people should try to flee from, even it might be getting out of the frying pan into the fire. So we're back to the big question facing the United Kingdom: can we find that elusive labour market productivity that gets us out of the economic and fiscal crisis?
Okay, well, I think that's mission one in the list of missions, is to raise the UK's growth rate to be the fastest growing economy in the G7. Nicola, is there likely to be anything new sort of if
So
a new government embraced the Welsh Constitutional Commission or anything? Is there anything to make the union more appealing?
I think the bigger risk is that the UK government ignores the Welsh Constitutional Commission, frankly, but they shouldn't, and they should pay attention to what comes out of that process, because that will signal some discontent with the way things are, not just in Scotland. There are some things that can be addressed. Sewell, for example, the Sewell Convention is that convention that says that yes, the UK Parliament is sovereign despite devolution, but by convention they will not pass laws, make laws in areas that are otherwise devolved without the consent of the devolved institutions. Now, that convention held pretty well until Brexit, has been somewhat shaken by developments since then. it's not dead. I think Ciaran maybe at one point suggested it was. I don't think it's completely dead, but it's definitely ailing. And I think there is a need, and there's a relatively easy need, to try and restore that. And because it's not just a constitutional convention, it's a symbol. It's a symbol of the status of the democratic foundations of the devolved legislatures and their place and their authority within the United Kingdom. And that has been eroded. And I think there are steps that a government can take if they want to try and restore that, because it's fundamental to trust. The other thing I would say is around intergovernmental relations, and can there be mechanisms and approaches to that enable the devolved governments to have a genuine voice over those UK-wide matters that affect them, not just in devolved areas, but in reserved areas as well. And a recognition on the part of the UK government that devolution didn't just happen somewhere else. It didn't just happen in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. It happened in the UK, and it changed the UK, and there has not been recognition of that within the UK, really, I think, from within the UK government, from the foundations of devolution. And I think I'm not very optimistic about this, many of those things. Some things are easier than others, but I think these are the challenges for the UK government, whoever leads it.
Okay, I was going to just ask Coree, very quick question. Any chance that a Conservative government might ever be tempted just to say, yeah, maybe it's a deal? We all say they haven't got any potential allies in Parliament, to do a deal on another independence referendum to get SNP support.
I mean, you never know, but I can't imagine it's likely. I mean, that unionism is so fundamental to a Conservative identity. The emphasis on preserving the union, even at times when their policies, in fact, undermine the union, is so important. But I guess you never know who emerges as leader and what attention they'll pay to Scotland, how they'll approach Scotland. So I think nothing's certain in these very uncertain times.
Okay, well, we're going to, I think nothing certain in these very uncertain times is probably the right line on which to leave this lunch hour. So thank you very much to Coree Brown Swan, John Curtice, Nicola McEwen and Ciaran Martin, who's joining us from Singapore, of all places. Thanks very much for joining this lunch hour. There will be more UK and Changing Europe lunch hours to come, and hopefully soon also a recording of our Fringe event, which is absolute mega pack sellout on a new constitution for Scotland and the process of designing one at the SNP Fringe event in Aberdeen yesterday. So thank you all very much. Thank you to my panelists, and have a good afternoon.